All right, let's discuss this now. The possible implications of the Constitutional Court's ruling on the MK party, in particular its leader. And for that discussion, we're joined by the party's spokesperson, Nhlamulo Ndhlela, and political analyst, Professor Dirk Coetzee, who is attached to the University of South Africa. To both of you gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Let me start in studio. Mr. Ndhlela, good evening to you. Earlier today, you were quoted as saying that the former president and leader of the MK party is not power hungry. He never said he wanted to go to parliament. How does that fit in with him bringing a counter application in this very same court case where he even called for 6 judges to recuse themselves because they were part of the very decision that led him to be sent to jail in the first place? Balance the two for us.
No, I think there may be a misconception here on your end, in the sense that President Zuma stated that if the people want him to lead and become president of this country, that will be the case. And hence we're gunning for a 2/3 majority to change this constitution to ensure that we bring President Zuma into power. But also, when I said that President Zuma, in this case, is not power hungry, I meant exactly that. President Zuma is not a power-hungry man. He's a selfless leader. And based on whatever decision we take at that point in time, when we win the 2/3 majority, when we get into government, we'll make a determination at that point in time. And he will then make a decision if he wants to be president or if he wants to deploy someone else. That's just what our position has always been.
How does that make sense, that he will make a decision about whether or not he wants to lead, or he may put forward someone else in order to lead as president? And of course, all of this is predicated on the MK winning the election hands down. In other words, defeating all of the parties in contention. How would that work if he is not allowed to be a member of parliament?
Well, that's your view and a misconception that it's a difficult issue to understand. We're saying to you that there's other options as well. President Zuma doesn't have to be, president of the country if he doesn't want to be. That's the first point. What I'm also going to say to you is that there's other options, and those options are with the UN Human Rights Committee, of which there was a similar case in Sri Lanka, where a court, similar to what is happening here, upheld a court order that led to a political leader in that country not being able to run for elections. And guess what? The United Nations Human Rights Committee overturned it, and he was able to run for elections. So it's not the end of the road for President Zuma.
Are you suggesting that he may end up at this UN court?
Well, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're taking this matter to the United Nations Human Rights Committee and to get it overturned. So there's many ways to skin a cat here, clearly. But also, let's focus on the fact that we want a 2/3 majority so we can change this constitution that's based on Roman Dutch law, that doesn't represent us, and that is totally being abused continuously by judges that are not even elected by our people. And 6 of them, who ought to have recused themselves, still continue to preside over the matter. I mean, how is it possible that these 10 judges, unelected, make decisions that affect and infringe on the rights of South Africans, who, by the way, want their leader, in the form of President Zuma, to be in parliament? So that's just, again, the nature of this system.
All right, let's get the views of Professor Dirk Coetzee. Prof, I hope you were able to hear Mr. Ndhlela's submissions. Let's begin with the first element about the former president not being power hungry, and therefore he may not necessarily want to go to parliament. He can still send someone else, but there is also the confirmation now in studio through Mr. Ndhlela that he actually may still take this further because he doesn't feel satisfied by our courts in South Africa. So he may take it to a court outside of South Africa.
Yeah, that is very difficult to bring the different ends together because on the one hand, it is very clear President Zuma is absolutely fully involved in this election campaign. He is now, to a large extent, the personification or the face of the MK party, and therefore there's almost no way in which one can argue that it is not for in order for the part for his involvement is in order to be able to receive the maximum support, the maximum power in parliament. And that is why this party talks about a two-thirds majority also. So it is all about power, but that applies to all political parties. All of them want to get the maximum out of this election. And that includes President Zuma, that includes the MK party, even without him as the leading figure in parliament, but also the other parties. So I don't think it can be dismissed by anyone as if this is an effort of being there for the sake of other things except to have the most power possible in parliament. I think what is also now introduced as a new element is the fact of going beyond the South African judiciary or the legal system. In some instances, there is the possibility to go, for example, to the African Court of Human and People's Rights. For example, the public protector is in the process of doing that. But to a large extent, I think we have to look at our own constitution, and our constitution is saying the Constitutional Court is the Supreme Court in South Africa, is the court with the highest authority, and there's no possibility for any form of official appeal beyond that. So whatever it is taken to in any other format, the Human Rights Commission is simply a commission. It has absolutely no legal powers. South Africa is a member of the United Nations, but it hasn't got any legal authority over South Africa. It's simply an advisory body of the United Nations. So nothing can be done from that quarters. There's no other international court that has any authority over the South African legal system. So in that sense, today's judgment is, for all purposes, in terms of the South African legal system and the South African constitutional dispensation, the final say.
Prof, before I come back to Mr. Ndhlela in studio, you constantly hear this messaging from the MK party that the judges in South Africa, first of all, they're not elected by the people of this country, and what authority do they have over someone who is elected by the people? Not so long ago, it was former President Zuma himself who constantly reminded people that the state is made up of three arms: the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature, that's parliament. Today, the comments are to such an extent that these judges are almost a law unto themselves. Make sense of that for us, and how we, ordinary South Africans, should digest that kind of language from the MK.
Well, first of all, the way in which our judges are appointed is that the initiative comes from the public. The public can nominate some of them. It goes to the Judicial Service Commission, which is a combination of persons within the legal fraternity, as well as members of parliament, multi-party composition of members of parliament. They do the public interviewing as the representatives of all of us. That is why we have an election like the one of next week. So they are there on behalf of the public to determine which judges ultimately are the best placed to fill the positions on the bench. And then there's a vote in the National Assembly about it. There must be a majority for all the candidates there. And then it is referred to the president for the final appointment. That one must compare to what some would say are elected judges. Now, take, for example, the way in which the American Supreme Court is constituted, where the president of the United States makes the proposal or nomination of judges. It goes through the two houses on Capitol Hill. Ultimately, there's a vote in the Senate. which is a political body, and then the judge is basically elected there. And as a result of that, we have today now a Supreme Court in the United States, which is absolutely politicized. They make judgments which are not about the law, but very much about political considerations. Now we have a choice, either what we have today or that type of system that we see in the United States at the moment, where the system is actually being abused.
Is that where you want to lead us, Mr. Ndhlela, and the MK party? Again, I place emphasis on whether or not you are going to get the 2/3 that you are talking about. Is that where you want to go, where you want South Africa to go, where the court system is, quote unquote, politicized, as the prof says?
We will do that review at that point when we sit with our leadership and make that determination. At this point, I'm not going to profess on the outcomes of what that would look like. But I think what's important here to also highlight is that President Zuma, by the way, doesn't have to go, I mean, we're unperturbed with this outcome. He doesn't have to go to Parliament for him to lead this country, like I said to you. We can still deploy someone as a party to lead as a president. And President Zuma, in effect, by being president of Mkhonto weSizwe, can still lead the country because the wisdom that that president will be drawing from President Zuma. Is that not so? So we're not perturbed with this outcome that everyone now, thinks that that's the end of the road. No, not at all. We're going to continue with our campaign, and this actually more so reinforces our position. And people on the ground are now realizing that this system is not working. So this Roman Dutch law constitution that the prof is referring to must change. It does not reflect the people of this country. And that's just the reality. So we're gunning for the 2/3 majority to change this constitution.
The element about going to the UN Human Rights Committee, the professor also very clear there that that particular body of the UN does not have any legal authority over South Africa's legal system. So, exercise in futility?
No, you may see it as an exercise in futility. But what I had mentioned right now was that there's case law to that effect in a form of in Sri Lanka. And by us being part of the UN, how is it possible that we can necessarily be separated from that? I mean, these are submissions that we made to the court, the ConCourt, as part of our submissions to raise this issue. So for the prof to now pronounce that that cannot be when there's case law to that effect, that's his position. But what I'm telling you is that we are going to the United Nations Human Rights Committee, not Commission, and that body will be the one that will preside over this matter. And then let's take it from there. So I wouldn't want to profess on something that has not yet taken its course.
Again, I borrowing from you,
yes,
we would not want to waste time talking about an event that may or may not happen. Is there a firm date as to when President Zuma intends going to that UN body?
Well, naturally, the decision was taken today. So we're in consultation with the legal team, and we'll make that pronouncement at the right time. But that is the position.
Can I then sway this discussion before we go back to the prof and talk the politics within the MK? Mm-hmm. Former President Zuma clearly is the embodiment of the MK party. Yes, he may not go to Parliament, but whoever is going to lead on behalf of the MK will take instructions from President Zuma, sitting in Gandla, presumably. And what is it about the MK wanting to change the South African legal system? What is wrong with it?
Let's start by saying that this legal system benefits the few. I mean, I've touched on issues related to the Irrigation Act that have now been transferred to this dispensation, where people today, have got rights to water, and they're now commercializing that water. And guess what? The government took these individuals who have benefited off the back of the Apartheid Irrigation Act to introduce about new water reforms. And guess what happens? They took it right up to the Constitutional Court. Guess what? It's blocked in the Constitutional Court right now because it seemed to be unconstitutional. That government ought to then intervene and introduce water reforms so that people can have water as a human right. But today, those same few individuals from the apartheid system who got those irrigation rights are now commercializing it and wanting to form water banks. Does that make sense to you, Xoli? Does that make sense to you? No. So this constitution is based on Roman Dutch law. You're not Dutch. Are you Roman? No. That's why we need to change it. So it reflects us as a people in this country, and more so, serve the downtrodden people and the poorest of people in this country, including the fact that we must take back our land. This constitution will not allow us to do so unless we change it and return back the land to their rightful owners, the kings and the downtrodden children in this country. We need to change this constitution so we can nationalize the mines and ensure beneficiation of these mineral resources to our country. Right now, all these minerals are leaving the country. And guess who's benefiting? White corporate. That's just the reality. So does that constitution serve us? No. We need to nationalize the National Reserve Bank and then separate the Prudential Authority from the Reserve Bank. Why? So the Prudential Authority must have its own independence, and they must be the ones that make a determination as to whether your account probably should be closed or not. We need to nationalize the banks as well. These banks are not structured in such a way whereby they benefit the downtrodden child. If you look at the past 10 years, they've been issuing microloans to our people and continuing to burden them in debt. So is that a constitution that will help us in terms of changing this country? No. The same banks, by the way, get involved in fraudulent forex trading. Guess what? Competition Commission gives them a slap on the wrist when they've made hundreds of millions of rands. And then you want to come and talk about corruption?
Okay.
Xoli, think again.
Let's bring back the professor. Professor Kotze, the direction in which the MK party wants to take South Africa, what's your view on it? Where would South Africa go, and what would the view of it be to investors? Because at the end of the day, people have got to have jobs. We don't want to go the route of Zimbabwe.
Yes, I think what we've heard from MK so far, and now we've just seen the election manifesto also, although it was already available for quite some time, is that there's actually different components within the policy domain of MK. On the one hand, when it comes to economic matters, I think they position themselves to the left, similar to that of the EFF and maybe even beyond that. And there's a lot of overlap with the EFF on matters like, for example, expropriation without compensation, without matters with respect to land in general, and similar issues. The EFF does not necessarily share the same views with respect to the legal system and with the constitution, and that it must go into a parliamentary system, and that the constitution should be abolished or the constitutional sovereignty should be removed. So that is on the one side. On the other side, I would say MK has, in some instances, actually a very conservative approach, especially on social issues, with respect to, for example, the fact that President Zuma made a pronouncement at some point that young women who are pregnant must go to Robben Island, that children are not supposed to have any legal rights in their relationship with their parents, that the compulsory military service must be introduced again, that there are, with respect to the legal system, it must become African common law, and several other issues. Over and above the introduction of a stronger component in terms of traditional leadership, which to a large extent is there already. I think there's a huge contestation about who qualifies as traditional leaders and who not. There's a long-standing commission that tried to determine that, because many of the traditional leaders were actually appointed by the British during colonial time. And that started to confuse what is the real, genuine traditional leaders and those who have been appointed by these different systems during the apartheid period also. So this is a mixed bag, therefore, and it's very difficult, I would say, for the electorate really to determine what is going to be the policy package that ConCourt would like to implement, because there's very little sort of touching points with what we experience at the moment in terms of economics as well as the social dispensation, and a complete turnaround or turnover that MK proposes. I guess that the main purpose thereof is to say, well, the current situation is not acceptable, and therefore we have to have a radical turnover or transformation. But normally the cost of something like that is not taken into account, and it will be a complete upheaval that will result from this. So that is the other side that MK, I think, will have to account for. But what is promising, I would say, is the way in which they've responded to today's judgment. The fact that they are not up in arms, but there's a quite responsible approach to this. And I think, to add on to what the spokesperson of MK Party is saying, is that it is not actually absolutely necessary for the leader of a party, the president of a party, to be in Parliament. And there's a number of quite important examples where it didn't happen, and these parties still continue to grow, even as governing parties. The current president of Turkey is a good example of that.
Yeah. Professor, before I bring it back to studio, perhaps final comments from you as we wrap it up. The MK this past weekend showing its popularity, if you like. Orlando Stadium was full to capacity. And I'm wondering what you think that represents in terms of the final outcome of the vote. Is the MK likely to have the 2/3 that Mr. Ndhlela speaks of? Is the MK likely to perhaps play the kingmaker role? I'm trying to gauge from you where you see the MK party post the May 29th result.
Well, I think I would say there's quite a consensus that in KwaZulu-Natal, the MK party will be a very significant factor, might be even the one that receives the most of the votes there. It will certainly be one of the key players in determining who will be part of a coalition government there. What is unique, I would say, of the KwaZulu-Natal situation is that MK, the ANC, the IFP and the DA are all involved in a neck-to-neck contest there. And it will be exceptionally interesting to see who of them ultimately will be able to constitute a government. If we look at the national situation, Mpumalanga seems to be also have some support for MK party, but the rest of the country, it's not the case. Just this past week, there was the by-election in Madibeng in the northwest, where the MK only received 1.4%, the ANC 70%, and the EFF around in the high 20s. And in other provinces, I think it will be similar. So the predictions are, or the opinion polls are saying somewhere around 8%. It will be very much in line with what happened with COPE in 2009 with 7%, the EFF in 2014 with 6%. So if it's in round about 8, 9%, 10%, then it will be more or less in line with that. And I think that is what I can foresee what will be a likely outcome.
Yeah. All right. Mr. Ndhlela, let's wrap it up. If you don't get the 2/3 majority, the professor seems to be ranging 8%. That's what COPE got back in 2009. And the EFF was also somewhere around those figures initially when they came onto the stage, if you do get this kingmaker status, what are your conditions that you may put forward in terms of getting into a coalition arrangement in South Africa, if indeed it does come to that post this election?
Well, let me start by saying that we're not going into this election with coalitions in mind at this point. The Prof can refer to polls. The question is, what methods, what formula was used to arrive at these 8% that he's referring to? We know, from where we're sitting, having been on the ground, and the fact that, remember, there's 4.4 million new registered voters. 77% of that is the youth. Did we ever imagine that that could be the case? No. So why is it baffling that we could potentially get a majority vote? Why?
We because know the EFF is fighting for exactly the same demographic, young people.
Well, that's the EFF. The EFF is a progressive party. If it means that we have to get the two-thirds majority or majority vote by having a united front, then so shall it be. We have consensus in many fronts. But what we're saying is that determination will only be made at that point in time. Right now, our campaign is to focus on getting a two-thirds majority. And also, remember we've stated that when you're a leader of the party, we don't have to deploy you as a minister.
Please allow me to interrupt you.
We have to hold the leaders accountable.
Allow me to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
You talk about a consensus. Are you in any way referring to some formal arrangement between the MK party and the EFF that you could cooperate, you could go into some kind of an alliance post this election?
I'm taking it off the back of what the Prof mentioned to say a lot of EFF's manifesto and our people's mandate has got a lot of similarities there. So if it gets to that point where we have to engage with like-minded parties, like the EFF to an extent, then we'll engage with them. We'll engage with other parties as well.
For now, there have not been any formal discussions between the two.
No, we've had discussions even prior, but there's nothing that has been formalized. Nothing at all. And it's not only with the EFF. We've had discussions with many other parties, naturally so. But at this point in time, we're not talking a coalition. That's why you always hear us talking two-thirds majority. And that's what we want. At that point, after the elections, depending on what the outcome thereof is, we'll make that determination. Right now, focusing on two-thirds.
All right. Mr. Nhlamulo Ndhlela, spokesperson of the MK Party, thank you very much for your time and contribution. Professor Dirk Coetzee, let me thank you very much for your contributions this evening.